everybody. This is SAAD for the SAAD Truth. In my courses, I typically have a project that students have to do where they have to actually conduct research to test a particular research question and a set of hypotheses that they're interested in. So what I thought I'd do today is share with you portions of the slides that I typically use in my courses. I've edited some of the slides because I didn't want to go into too much details here, but it should hopefully give you a good sense of the type of discussion that we have in class when we're trying to decide how to go about doing the projects. So let's start with I guess a overview of how to conduct research. So of course one has to first identify a research question that is of interest. Now, when I'm teaching consumer behavior, consumer psychology, I tell the students that it shouldn't be too difficult to identify interesting topics because, of course, this is part of their lived experiences, right? We are all consumers in a myriad of ways in a given day, and so there should be endless ways by which we can identify interesting topics to do research on. So the first thing is identify a research question. So the overarching issue to be tackled in the project. So here's an example that I use in my class. How might specific personality traits be linked, correlated to pathological gambling? The idea here is that pathological gamblers might have a personality profile that is different from non-pathological gamblers, and in this project we'd like to investigate what some of those personality traits might be. And so it's a very clear, easy to understand research question. Then of course what one has to do is conduct an academic literature review to get a sense of what's been done on this general topic. And so what you'd like to do here is contextualize the work that you're going to do within a greater scientific narrative. And so you typically will go to academic databases, say for example Web of Science, and then try to get a sense of what's been done so that then, as I said, you could position your research within that broader storyline. Then of course, once you have your research question, you have a sense of what's been done, you posit a set of hypotheses. Now these are statements that are empirically testable. So for example, if I were to say H1 for hypothesis 1, men consume hardcore pornography more so than women, this is a statement which I can go out, collect data, and see if it is refuted or not. Once we have the research question, we've got our hypotheses, then we have to decide, well, how do I go about to collect the data that would allow me to properly test this hypothesis? And there's a myriad of ways to do so. I'll discuss a few today. So we can conduct experiments, we could administer surveys, we could carry out a content analysis, we could perform an observational study, or we could use secondary data. And I'll discuss all these differences with specific examples in a few minutes. Once we've decided on the specific data collection procedure and the methodology, we still have to choose the measurement technique. So for example, if I'm going to use a survey to collect data, well, how will the questions in the survey be structured? Should I use Likert scales? This is, statements that you strongly agree to strongly disagree to. Should I use a semantic differential scale? This would be where you have at two ends of the continuum antonyms, good, bad, interesting, uninteresting. And there are reasons why you might use one or another. If I'm using Likert scales, should I use odd number of points, strongly agree, strongly disagree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree? In other words, I give you an opportunity to choose a neutral point, or should I give you an even numbered scale where I am forcing you to take a position either on the agree or disagree side? All of these questions are part of the general rubric of choosing the measurement technique. Then of course one has to choose the sampling strategy and the sampling size. Will I be using quota sampling? Would I be just using a convenience sample? Do I use stratified random sampling? how do I decide what constitutes an appropriate sample size given the study that I wish to carry out? All of these things are questions that typically one has to have a valid answer to. Now that I've collected the data, I need to analyze the data. And so depending on the particular data that I have at my disposal, and depending on the hypotheses that I've posited, will determine the types of statistical tests that I need to use. Should I use a t-test? Should I conduct an ANOVA, which is analysis of variance for those of you who don't know? Should I conduct a multiple regression, a stepwise regression? The reason why I usually spend quite a bit of time on this particular point with students, certainly undergraduate students, is that they oftentimes think that having a pictorial aid, a histogram, a pie chart, constitutes data analysis. Now, of course, it doesn't, right? You're more than welcome to use these pictorial aids because they help the audience to understand the pattern of your data. But that in itself is not a statistical test, right? You have to conduct the appropriate inferential statistics to be able to decide whether your hypothesis is refuted or not. And then, of course, once you've analyzed the data appropriately, you decide, you come to a conclusion as to whether the data seems to support your hypothesis or not. And here you have to understand how to analyze statistical outputs. Typically, academics have used p-values. Now there's a greater use of effect sizes, but irrespective of how you interpret the final results, there has to be a accepted benchmark by which you are able to conclude there is evidence that my hypothesis has been refuted or not. So now that I've given you sort of a general sense of the steps implicit to the research process, I'd like to spend a bit of time going over each of these various data collection procedures. So here we go. So experiments. Many of you, of course, are intuitively familiar with the concept of an experiment, but it's worthwhile to sort of give some of the key definitional components of an experiment. Well, typically they're conducted in a laboratory setting, but they don't need to be. They could also be conducted in field experiments or naturalistic experiments, but typically we conduct them in a laboratory setting precisely because the issue that we'd like to study, the causal relationship that we'd like to establish, is such that we're going to control for everything, any confounding or extraneous variable other than that which we wish to manipulate. So typically we manipulate an independent variable or multiple independent variables, and then we check their effects on some other dependent variable. And the idea is that if we've done the study properly, if the experiment has internal validity, then we're able to conclude, because we've controlled for everything else, that there's a causal relationship between these two sets of variables. Of course, a very, very integral element of an experiment is that participants are allocated across the conditions in a random manner. Otherwise, you will have what is referred to as systematic bias. So what would be an example of an experiment in the context of consumer research? And here I'm talking about a typical project that students might do in my course. Well, here's a great one. And I say great because it's a very simple experiment, yet that demonstrates a profoundly powerful phenomenon. So if, for example, you wanted to test the effects of packaging on the perceived quality of a product, so that's the general research question. How would you go about doing such a study? Well, you could create two types of packages, a fancy package and a not fancy package, and then you could put a product, say for example athletic socks, so it's the same product that you put in the two experimental conditions, and then one group of people will go through the fancy package experimental condition, and the other one will go through the non-fancy experimental condition, and then you'll ask them a whole bunch of questions about perceived quality. How likely is this sock to rip? How likely is it to yield blisters? How likely is it, how well do you think it'll do in terms of absorbing sweat? So whichever quality perception measures you'd like to use, then you're able to measure these perceptions. And then, of course, if you were from the school of Homo economicus, then you'd think, well, participants should arrive to the same overall quality perception because ultimately you're dealing with the exact same product. But of course, people are not, quote, rational in that sense, and not surprisingly, packaging matters. It turns out that people will give higher quality perception to the exact same product when it is placed in a fancy package. And so here the idea is, the general phenomenon is that how you package things matter, right? If I walk into class dressed in a three-piece suit, or I walk into class dressed like a surfer and I utter the exact same words, you might have different overall impressions about how much mastery I had over the material, even though I uttered the exact same thing, simply by virtue of what I was wearing. So this is an example of an experiment. You manipulate some variable, in this case, how fancy the packaging is, and then you check its effect on some dependent variable, in this case, quality perception. So that's the experimental approach. Now moving on to a few other approaches. The observational approach is where you actually think that the type of research that you'd like to conduct, or the type of research question that you're posing, actually requires for you to simply go out into the natural environment and observe behaviors in the field. This is very much what anthropologists do, what ethnographers do, right? They go out into the field and hopefully in an unobtrusive manner, they collect observational data. Typically here what you do is you develop a observational coding scheme. In other words, you have if you like, a sheet that allows you to exactly code for specific behaviors that you're interested in. So let's take an example in a consumer setting. Suppose I wanted to find out whether the shelf location of a product in a supermarket affects its purchase likelihood. Well, this is probably not the type of study that you could do in a laboratory. I mean, yes, you could, construct a whole elaborate shopping setting in a laboratory, but it's probably best to simply go out into the real world, into a, say, grocery store, and see how people actually behave. And so what would you do here? You might have a coding sheet that is simply, it's very simple. It consists simply of 3 items. You either code if somebody purchases something at above eye level, at eye level, or below eye level. And so in this case, not surprisingly, of course, people find that shoppers are much more likely to purchase things at eye level, precisely because people are cognitively and physically lazy. They want that which is easily accessible, and this is why companies are likely to spend more money to have their product at that specific location in a store. So that would be an example of an observational study. You're not manipulating things in a laboratory. You simply go out into the real world and observe behavior. Moving on to a third type of data collection procedure. Now, this is one that many people are not familiar with. This is the content analysis. So there are certain types of research that you can't really observe. You can't conduct an experiment. It is based on analyzing existing stimuli. So that, I guess the best way to explain it is to give you specific examples. Suppose I wanted to find out if the portrayal of women in advertisements in magazines has changed from the 1950s to today, right? So these are real existing stimuli, magazine ads, and I'd like to know whether women's portrayal has changed within those 2 temporal periods. Well, I obviously don't conduct an experiment here. I don't do an observational study. I have to actually go to this stimuli, this existing content, the 2 sets of magazines from 1950s and from today, and do an analysis of that content. Hence, that's why we call it a content analysis. So oftentimes, for example, archival data might be put through a content analysis approach. And so you must have, in this case, again, some sort of coding scheme. So for example, you might say, well, I'd like to code the number of different roles that women are portrayed in ads, from 1950s and today. So, and that what you probably will predict is that the multitude of roles that women are portrayed in is much greater today, precisely because it reflects societal changes. So in this case, you are conducting a content analysis of existing material. And moving on, I'll discuss two more approaches for today. Surveys, this is probably the technique that most people are familiar with. Surveys, as many of you have probably heard the term, establish correlation between variables, but they don't establish causality. So for example, if going back to the example that I mentioned earlier with pathological gambling and personality traits, how would I do this study? Well, I would administer a survey that would ask of people a bunch of questions that capture, how they score on pathological gambling, that captures how they score on each of the personality traits that I'm interested in studying. And then this would allow me to test whether there is a relationship, whether there is a correlation between the personality traits in question and pathological gambling. And so to do that, I would use a survey-based approach. I mean, a couple of things to think about when you're thinking about surveys. This is actually quite shocking how many times people make this mistake. The question, a particular question, has to be mutually exclusive and mutually exhaustive. So for example, if you're asking income questions and the first item is do you make $0 to $10,000, and then the second possible answer is do you make $10,000 to $20,000, well, obviously this fails on being mutually exclusive, because if I make $10,000, I don't know whether I should answer the first box or the second box. And mutually exhaustive means that every possible answer should be capturable, if you'd like, by the survey. The other thing that I wanted to briefly mention is that typically when we think of surveys, we think of them as being, paper and pencil, but you could have in-person surveys, you could have telephone surveys, of course you could do online versus offline surveys, and there isn't a, this type of approach is always the best. It's really a trade-off between cost and accuracy. Some modes of administering surveys yield more accurate data, but then of course the trade-off is that they're typically more costly. And then finally, there is another type of data collection procedure that I'd like to discuss today, and that's secondary data. So the data collection procedures that I've just mentioned are all primary data collection procedures, meaning you are the one who actually collects the data. But in many cases, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. In many cases, the types of research questions that you're asking, the types of hypotheses that you are positing, are ones that correspond to data that someone else has already collected for you. So for example, you have syndicated data sources like scanner data or AC Nielsen data or census data. For example, Statistics Canada is the Census Bureau, right? Or you could have databases such as the World Health Organization. All of these organizations have already collected data for you, which then you could tap into to test a particular research question and a set of hypotheses that you're interested in testing. So in 2007, I had published a paper in a medical journal where I had investigated the links between the global male to female suicide ratios and specific economic data. The idea being that could it be that the ratio of male to female suicide is correlated to particular economic indicators. And now in this case, I'm not going to go out and collect that global suicide data. I'm not going to go out and collect the global economic data. There are organizations that have already done that for me. I tap into that data set. Of course, I cite where the source of my data is from, and then I conduct the appropriate analyses. So I hope that I've given you a good sense, and of course there are other ways to collect data, but this gives you a good sense of the multitude of ways by which a consumer researcher, but incidentally, of course, the discussion here is not specific only to consumer research, how we can go about collecting data that to address a wide range of research questions. So to summarize, we've got experiments, we've got observational approach, we've got content analysis, surveys, and secondary data. So that gives you hopefully a good sense of the exciting projects that my students do in my courses, and certainly that I do as an academic researcher. Hope you enjoyed this clip, please share it, and look forward to interacting with you on social portals soon. Cheers.